Hello, everyone. I'm back to discuss a book that is fairly commonly mentioned nowadays, or maybe more a few years ago, but not as much in book form as in a TV series. That book is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. I have not watched the TV series, nor have I read anything else by Margaret Atwood, but at the end of last summer, I picked up The Handmaid's Tale because I guess I just seen it and Margaret Atwood herself referenced enough times that, and it was a short enough book, that I decided to see what it was all about. I'm finally getting around to talking about it now, but there was a lot about it that I found memorable, so I think it's still worth returning to. The book is a dystopian novel. Not really sci-fi. I think speculative fiction is the term I've heard thrown around more in reference to The Handmaid's Tale. It was published originally in 1985, and it depicts a totalitarian society, one particularly demanding and demeaning to women. And the author Atwood describes it as nothing completely new or completely fictional, but merely an extrapolation of trends that she's already seen. The book reads as sort of a spiritual successor to George Orwell's 1984, but with more of a feminist bent to it. This comparison isn't meant as a slight to Atwood at all. The resemblance is clear, and I think she's said as much herself that she was influenced by 1984. Both books portray totalitarian governments that convey a similar overall mood, but explore different implications of the two worlds. The Handmaid's Tale feels perhaps even more stifling at times because in viewing the world through the perspective of a woman, and not a particularly well-off woman, even relatively speaking, there's less focus on the broader society and political situation in the world as a whole, and we're really dragged down into the main character's day-to-day plight of existence, while being allowed to speculate and explore just a little bit on the side into other aspects of society. I was impressed and sometimes a bit overwhelmed by the sheer amount of loose ends and open doors that Atwood invites us to speculate about from the very start. This isn't a particularly long book, and based on the pacing of the first few chapters, it becomes clear very, very soon that there is simply no way we're ever going to have answers given for 90% or more of the questions we have about what's going on here in the world as a whole. This is not going to be a George R.R. Martin saga. What we do see of the broader society fits together in a coherent way due to Atwood's convincing world building, yet we realize that a lot of the specifics of this world will remain open for our speculation or unexplained. I think people will vary in how much they like this, but it's especially interesting to compare that to some of these popular fantasy novels like Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, in which basically the author tells us, sometimes to the point of even showing off, just how intricately they've conceived of this fantasy world, leaving no stone unturned. And for this reason, it's totally clear to me how a TV adaptation could explore this world in much greater depth. I mean, at first I was thinking, how on earth were they able to pad a book that's just 10 hours in audiobook form into a 5+ season series, and who knows how many it'll be. But considering the sheer number of ideas Atwood has just planted in here, it's not hard for me to believe at all. And of course, whether I want to have all these open questions about the society in The Handmaid's Tale, which is called Gilead, the name of the society, whether I want these questions actually answered is an entirely different question. I'm not really totally sure. But yeah, the tip of the iceberg feeling was a big part of what impressed me about this book. So what are a few of the many themes explored in this book? One is an exploration of unrestrained religious fundamentalism. Some view this novel as an attack on Christianity, since the religion in the novel is clearly rooted in Christianity. However, Atwood isn't trying to make a point quite as clear as this is the essence of Christianity. The religion in the novel is not really Christianity at all as we know it, but it's one that sects of Christianity could become if taken to extremes and used as a weapon of a totalitarian regime or of the ruling class. Of course, that's not to say that Christianity as it exists in modern society doesn't have any of these elements either. In Gilead, the people at the top are really no more devoted to any Christian principles than anyone else, maybe even less so. The religion is simply a convenient buttress for the government. And this may be true in some aspects of real-world religion as well, where many supposed higher-ups or enforcers of the hierarchy are less devoted believers than some of those lower in power. Or maybe they are genuine believers, but they also place a disproportionate emphasis on worldly goals rather than spiritual ones. For a timely example, but one that's not as close to home for those of us living in the United States, okay, obviously this is a very Western perspective on things, but I've read just a little bit about the Russian Orthodox Church and how basically Vladimir Putin's authoritarian government has effectively co-opted a lot of church leaders into providing symbolic support for his government, because those leaders who have dissented have faced pretty severe consequences. As an aside, if you want to learn more about this, I'd recommend as a starting point Joshua Yaffa's book, Between Two Fires, which covers this and other interesting aspects of life and existence in modern-day Russia. And this is all especially timely timely given the current events in Ukraine and what many are now seeing as the failure of the higher-ups in the Russian Orthodox Church to condemn Russia's aggression. And that's not to say that there are no dissenters within the church either. In recent days, quite a few have emerged, but this is quite a courageous act on their part. But I'm digressing here, and I don't mean to bring that up just to find a convenient outside scapegoat to turn our attention away from religion, particularly Christianity in the U.S. I think it's valuable, whether you're Christian or not, to, in a sort of open-minded way, ask the question, what about today's forms of Christianity is really not inherently Christian at all, but is more of a societal creation of Christian practice that might at times do even more harm than good? By encouraging us to ask this sort of question, the novel is not unequivocally critical of religion as a whole, but Atwood is critical of using religion as the core primary justification for anything, since she shows us how easy it is to become confused or misled into thinking that a religion stands for things that are obviously harmful from an outsider's perspective. It'd also be interesting to ponder to what extent the consequences we see in the novel could arise in other major world religions aside from Christianity, as I suspect some of them could come from just about any religion. But certain aspects, such as the attitudes towards women, might more naturally be justified under some modern religious frameworks than others. The novel is also interesting as yet another exploration of a totalitarian society, particularly as this novel was published during the decline of the Cold War era. Gilead, the society in the novel, is undoubtedly a totalitarian society. I'll define what I mean by that too, because I think it's easy to equate totalitarian with authoritarian, the latter meaning a government led by a central authority, or a dictator. But you can have an authoritarian government that's not totalitarian. Totalitarianism refers to a society in which every aspect, the totality of everyday life, is wrapped up in the political system. Going to school, shopping for groceries, family life, even perhaps your very thoughts, as we see in 1984's concept of thought crime. Everything is political and must be geared towards the political goals of society. I found it really interesting reading about this fictional totalitarian government around the same time as I was reading Iron Curtain, Anne Applebaum's in-depth exploration of real-world totalitarianism in Soviet satellite countries in the 20th century. Of course, Applebaum's work also explores the central topic of whether a truly totalitarian state can really even exist. Her ultimate conclusion is that no, it can't, because people will resist. And this can be hard to tell by just looking at a society from a bird's eye view, because people will behave as they're expected to behave. They'll conceal their feelings about the regime, even if they have any qualms, but this won't be apparent to others. And when our protagonist in The Handmaid's Tale, Offred, interacts with other characters who seem devoted to the government of Gilead, we really don't know whether they're in fact loyal servants of the regime, or if they're simply acting this way too because they don't trust her either. And this is a real-world dynamic I've seen in much of my reading about other totalitarian societies of the 20th century. We do, of course, eventually see some instances of resistance in The Handmaid's Tale, and it's interesting to think about what makes resistance more or less likely, more or less effective in different totalitarian societies. For example, in 1984, the end message seems to be that resistance is futile and that totalitarianism really has won, to the point where even the resistors, like the main character Winston, eventually see the so-called errors of their ways and join with the totalitarian monolith. Finally, you can't talk about The Handmaid's Tale without talking about feminism and the oppression of women in the society of Gilead. As some might say, I'm not giving that topic its full due here, that it's the point of the novel. I don't think it's the only point, but it's certainly up there. I just probably think I have less insight into this topic than many other reviewers out there, since it's been so thoroughly explored already. Put simply, women have gotten the short end of the stick in Gilead, and many of them have been relegated to incredibly demeaning roles, such as our protagonist Offred, whose sole point of existence is as a child bearer for the elites. Gilead feels at times extreme in its treatment of women, and at other times eerily similar to other things we still see today. For example, one societal tendency that's probably as old as time itself is to place the sole responsibility, or vastly disproportionate responsibility, for bearing children on women. And I mean that not just in that women must be the ones who carry a baby, which is sort of a biological necessity as we know it, but also that if anything goes wrong, if they can't conceive, if there's a miscarriage, if it's a girl instead of a boy, sadly, the women are held accountable. Despite that society as a whole certainly knows that, for example, a lot of the times the problem is the would-be father can't conceive. I mean, I don't really know the story well, but think of the whole saga of Henry VIII. This would be both inconvenient and embarrassing to acknowledge for the man, so they pretend like it's the woman's fault, and she resorts to other measures, like in the novel, trying to get impregnated by a different man, and then pretend it was the infertile male's official child after all. And although our society today in the US has at least mostly finally moved beyond this notion that only women can be infertile, we still haven't quite grappled with other dilemmas. Like the fact that it takes a man and a woman to have a child, yet the woman is ultimately the one who bears the full brunt of responsibility for raising this child. A responsibility which is often obligatory if we have laws forbidding abortion. That is to say, even if you believe in some form or another that abortion is ethically wrong, it's hard to deny that to both outlaw abortion and to more or less place the responsibility for the pregnancy and for raising the child on the mother herself, this all seems conveniently orchestrated to avoid what would otherwise pose a lot of inconvenience for the men involved. And this avoidance all comes at the expense of the mothers-to-be. And even if we have maybe made some progress on the expectations, the relative expectations we place on mothers versus fathers for child rearing and child care, I'd say it still remains true within our common psyche that fathers abandoning their children is not something that is seen positively, but the concept of mothers abandoning their children feels unforgivable, you know. I'm not saying that that's the way it should be, but it is the way that we tend to view things still. And in a separate direction, I thought it was interesting, particularly as a man myself, that Atwood explores this mildly paradoxical idea that perhaps a society in which women are directly oppressed, or even just treated unequally to men, doesn't actually make society better for men, but in fact makes it worse for everyone except maybe a few winners at the very top of the power structure. The men in The Handmaid's Tale, even arguably the commanders, don't exactly live lives that I would envy, despite being better off than their female counterparts. In today's world, it's easy to look at social policies or trends that benefit women and view the outcome as a zero-sum game. If women are winning, then I must be losing. But an alternative idea, and one that I've seen not only hinted at in this novel, but explored in other books as well, such as the nonfiction book Invisible Woman by Carolyn Criado Perez, is that elevating women may benefit everyone in society, and I really believe this is true. Of course, the elephant in the room that I don't think we discuss enough in modern discourse is that to achieve the long-term equalization of men and women, and concurrent elevation of everyone to higher well-being, there may actually be short-term losers among the men. And men like me who are advocating for greater equality can do this more easily because we have other advantages, like advanced degrees and education, that make us less likely to become the immediate short-term losers. So in bringing about and advocating for these policy changes, I think we have to consider further how those of us who are relatively stable and well-off can make small sacrifices so that those who would be the short-term losers of greater male-female equality aren't instead forced to make big sacrifices, while the rest of us kind of blame them for the resistance. Since ultimately that will lead to a lot of political resistance and frustration, if not addressed. And I reflected on that a bit in my review of the book Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluo, but once again I'm digressing, so back to the novel one more time. In conclusion, Margaret Atwood's novel Handmaid's Tale is a true modern classic and worthy of its status. It's short enough and referenced often enough that I think it's worth a read, but more than the plot itself, it's the tone of oppression, the development of the world, and the ideas explored that have earned it its reputation and its lasting fame. The ideas are only explored up to a certain point in a way that forces readers to imagine much further to draw our own logical conclusions, making this novel feel open-ended and a lot like a starting point, without real closure at the end. It wasn't my favorite thing I read last year in terms of sheer enjoyment, but it definitely is one I'm glad I read. Have you read anything else by Margaret Atwood that you'd recommend? Let me know, and if you subscribe, maybe someday I'll follow up with another review of an Atwood book. But until next time, bye, and happy reading.